Good morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. It's an honor to be your MC this morning. I am going to keep my remarks to an absolute minimum this morning for two reasons. First, you're going to love our topic and love our guest today. She's very dynamic, and I want to give her every second of our available time today. And second, and less importantly, my beloved Fresno State Bulldogs were thoroughly humiliated yesterday, 59-14, and that has left me rather speechless. But a reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Ellie Jacques is an educator and heroism expert from Southern Michigan. Her career started 10 years ago in Flint as a project manager for the Hero Roundtable Conference. In the mid-2010s, a municipal disaster struck the city, causing hazardous levels of lead in drinking water to adversely impact the mental and physical health of nearly 100,000 people. Reeling from the unfolding events and her own adverse health impacts, she adapted, drawing on her knowledge of heroes and the hero's journey to teach change and crisis navigation skills to folks in need. Her work in Flint is described in The Adversity Antidotes, how heroism education is being employed to navigate hardship and achieve well-being in Flint. She most recently served for 4 years as the career advisor at the largest public high school in Denver, using the hero's journey to help students explore and build toward future careers. Let's have a rousing ovation from our live audience at the Friendly House and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Ellie Jacques.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all today. I will share my screen here, and I think David and I did our due diligence to test everything, so you guys should be able to see that. But hello, everybody. My name is Ellie Jacques. Thank you, Todd, for that awesome introduction. And I serve on the board of directors for the Heroic Imagination Project. We are a 501c3 incorporated in California, and our mission is to inspire and instruct everyday heroes, which is a really cool, punchy, easy to say mission. That's very exciting. People say, wow, that's great. I know Superman. I know Batman. Sounds good. And then they think for a second, they say, well, how do you guys actually do that? What do you mean by heroes? How do you inspire them? How do you actually instruct this kind of magical behavior of heroism that we're so infatuated with as human beings? So I'm going to share a little bit about how HIP does that. How do we educate people to act more heroically? And some of these photos on the first slide just kind of give an illustration of how we interact with our students. We work with students of all ages, typically from about 4th grade and up. We do a lot of work in higher education, and we do a lot of consulting services with companies, with nonprofits, and with government departments. So today, just a quick agenda. I'll take you all through what HIP does. And in doing that, I'll give you a little overview of heroism, do a little hero one-on-one with you all. We'll also talk about HIP's origin stories because how the organization began is a really good illustration of how we teach heroism along 2 dimensions. So I'll tell that story. And we'll also discuss, for about half the presentation today, the hero's journey and how HIP uses this tool, this literary pattern, as a way to teach individuals how to navigate change and challenge. And Todd mentioned, I spent 6 years living in Flint during the Flint water crisis, and this tool was integral to my work. I started working with individuals who are structurally unemployed, doing basic social emotional skill building with them. And when that disaster hit our city, my work changed drastically, and it became all about recovery. It became about integrating these terrible experiences and understanding how this could have happened to us. So the hero's journey was just an essential tool for that situation that we were all in. We'll end with just mentioning a couple things you can all do to start your own hero training at home, and then we'll do a little Q&A. And I get a sense that this group really, really appreciates learning and that you're all quite curious. So I'll also make some resources available, some books, movies, videos, podcasts, and articles that you folks can all dig a little bit deeper into. I'll give you all a preview. This is the tool that I will talk about today, the hero's journey. And I hope, I know that some of you in the audience are definitely familiar with this model. Okay, whether you learned about it in English class or you know about it through because you're really, really into the Star Wars movies and you've watched the How It Was Made DVDs, you'll know that George Lucas used this and followed it very exactly to plot all of his Star Wars films. But this tool, not only does it illustrate what happens in our favorite books and movies and stories, but it also really mirrors what happens in our own lives every single day. And if you're not explicitly familiar with this, you are a little bit familiar. You might just not know it yet because you go on this journey every single day. Every time the environment interrupts what's going on with you and puts you into a state of disequilibrium, you go on a hero's journey in order to achieve equilibrium again. So what's neato is this is also the pattern that maturation and growth and development take in our lives. You guys can see over at about the 7 o'clock position on this model, there's this stage called the reward and transformation. Every time we go on a journey to address a change, navigate a challenge, address a crisis, there is going to be a reward at the end. And this is a really big, I think, advantage that the Hero's Journey tool gives us, because think about me in Flint, Michigan, with these mothers and fathers and children and these poor people who had gotten the wool, the government. I know you guys probably aren't super well versed on the Flint water crisis, but the government really pulled the wool over the eyes of the citizens and basically lied to tell them that their water was safe when it really wasn't. And that's a very traumatic experience. It's very hard to make sense of that. It's hard to contextualize it. It's hard to understand why this would happen to me. But by using the hero's journey and by using the various stories of the Flint water crisis, of heroes in that situation, we could actually illustrate to people, well, this is a really crappy situation, but here is what the reward and the transformation will be for you on the other side. And so it is really a way to illustrate what the silver lining can be in situations where just the paradoxes and the ironies abound, and they're really hard to understand. So really quickly, I won't belabor getting to know people because I know that you guys already know each other, but I would love, and I think this is okay. I think we can do this with Zoom, but if anybody could please in the chat, I would like you to type what your domain of interest is right now. This can relate to your job or it can relate to a hobby that you have, but I just kind of want to know who's in the room. So to give you some hints, these are my current domains of interest. I'm really interested in change management in business. I believe that navigating change is the meta competency of the future of our world. And if all of us can be better at navigating change, then we can be better at adapting to the future environment that we inhabit. And I'm also really into houseplants. Continuing education, that's great, Dave. I actually just started a master's degree, so I've been thrown into that continuing education realm. Health, yes. Economic equity and gardening. Aging with grace. Yes. Definitely my cat. Yep. Mitigating climate change. Yep, that's a big one. And Willie, we'll talk later. I'll mention how heroes' journeys are different in the second half of your life than they are in the first half. Okay, Dave's also into music. We love that. And I like to ask this question. I feel like in intros, we can get really focused on what do you do for a living, right? And we are so much more than what we do professionally. So I like to ask this question instead. All right, thank you all. I just appreciate getting to know people just a little bit. Yes, creative pursuits, music and photography. Thank you, Gail. Okay, so quickly here, I'll go through what the HIP mission and vision. Ooh, playing drums. My partner just bought a silent drum set, and I was very excited because I thought it was going to actually be silent, but he can hear the loud bangs in his headphones, but I can still hear him tapping and going crazy. And so I try to let him do that without getting too annoyed too quickly. Okay, so the HIP mission and vision, I'll go through this quickly, but we seek to inspire and instruct ordinary people to become everyday heroes. And I want to emphasize the word ordinary. We really believe that it doesn't take a great person to be a hero. It doesn't take somebody super strong or super smart. You just have to be an ordinary person who has the skills and the knowledge and the wherewithal in the situation to take action. And that's what we help people do. I think this is illustrated well by a quote from our founder. This is a cute rhyme from Dr. Zimbardo. He says that we want to take this egocentric me focus and turn it into a more sociocentric focus on the we. So some of you, I'm not going to assume that you also feel this way, but I know that I can sometimes feel quite self-absorbed, self-focused, a little bit protective, have a little bit of a hard shell towards the outside world, especially after COVID. I feel a little bit more cynical than I used to, maybe a little bit pessimistic, a little still not sure what the rules of engagement are post-pandemic for interacting with people. So Dr. Zimbardo says we want to take that closed off view that we might have, and we want to really help people pay attention to the environment around us and how we as people, how the individual really fits into the bigger puzzle around us, right? How am I responsible for my community? How do I fit in? Like, what is my role in keeping my community a safe and wonderful place to live? So our vision, we envision a world in which every student that enters any kind of school system, they will get the skills and the knowledge required to take effective action during challenging situations. So we think that effective action should be kind of a school subject right alongside social studies, English, math, and science. We think effective social action should also be a school subject, and we hope to make it so someday. We emphasize proactive everyday acts of heroism, and we really emphasize three key areas: compassion, kindness, and courage. And we know that our lessons, they do two things. They make people feel like they have an increased sense of social responsibility, okay? So suddenly they go from none of this is my problem to everything is my problem. I can do things. I am responsible for impacting change. We also know that our lessons increase individuals' competence to act. Some of our lessons dig very specifically into troubleshooting scenarios and what a person should do in these specific scenarios. A lot of our lessons dives deep also into special training. If you are a student, you might want to get Stop the Bleed training because we know, unfortunately, that gun violence plagues our schools nowadays. If you are an outdoor recreator like I am, you might decide to get your wilderness first aid or your wilderness first responder certification like I have. So our lessons increase the sense of, yes, I am responsible for keeping my community safe and awesome. And also I have the real skills and the competence that I need to do that. And we believe that if we increase acts of everyday heroism, it means that we can keep acts of heroism, those big, risky, death-defying acts, we can keep those rare. Something that seems a little bit paradoxical is HIP doesn't actually, we want to keep heroism rare. Yes, we want to build heroes. We want to make people more capable of heroic action, but we want to keep that behavior rare because it is really risky. Acts of heroism can be traumatizing. It can really incur some serious damage when those actions are called for. So we think that by increasing instances of everyday heroism, we can keep heroism, that big H action, we can keep those acts rare and keep people really safe. So our organization has 5 key activities that we engage in order to advance our mission. We do a lot of research. Our board writes a lot of papers. And currently we're doing some formal evaluation on our education programs, which is really great for me as a person working on a master's degree to learn how to do. We do a lot of story sharing. We highlight heroes consistently on our social media and in our newsletter because we know that it is important for people to have models. We have to have heroes because heroes show us how we want to live and who we want to be. We do a lot of consulting services. We work with Ford Motor Company 2 years ago. Our board president is traveling to India next week to work with a nonprofit there. And we have also worked with I worked with Virginia Tech University a couple years ago, so we do some work in higher ed as well. Right now, we have a great online training program. We have a level 1 and a level 2 hero training course that individuals can do. We also have families do that course together or small community groups. And we also organize events. One event that we hold biannually is called the Hero Roundtable Conference. And that is a conference where we bring together speakers to talk about heroes, and it's kind of TED style. So we keep those talks to 8 to 12 minutes. And I'll make sure that everybody has a link to dig into some of those talks if they want. But before we get any farther, let's talk about what a hero is. This is something that HIP, we feel a responsibility to have a definition of heroism and to make sure that that definition is very specific and almost kind of narrow. So the one that we have devised here is this, and this contains 3 key elements. So there is a voluntary action. The action is taken for the good of others. And there is also a risk or sacrifice potentially possible in the situation. So those 3 elements have to be present in order for someone to be a hero. And we know that heroic actions are by nature rare and reactive, right? And again, we want to encourage people to take heroic action and make sure they're prepared to do that, but we do want to make sure to keep heroic action rare. And that's why we talk about everyday heroism, which I'll go into on the next slide. So this definition is very 21st century. Over the course of human history, we've had different ideas of heroes. We had the heroes of Greek mythology. We had ideas from Confucianist culture and from the samurai about compassion, humility, goodness, and honor. We also had in the Middle Ages, we had this, rise of the idea of these chivalrous knights. We had the rise of a lot of religious heroes in the Middle Ages. But more recently, in the middle of the last century, we saw this super fun phenomenon happen where we had the rise of superheroes, right? Kind of the invention of the superhero. So we saw a lot of heroes getting infused into our pop culture at that time. And what's really exciting is in the last couple decades, this idea of the hero has expanded to include 2 elements. One is this idea that heroes are not great, extraordinary, rare figures, but they're actually pretty ordinary people. And ordinary people are all capable of doing heroic things. It doesn't take an extraordinary great man or anything like that. The other exciting development is now when we think about heroes, we also think a lot about personal development and fulfilling human potential. And there are a lot of folks in positive psychology circles, in education psychology circles that are asking, how can we use heroes to help give people a model of their kind of ideal self so that they can then become that ideal self? And I think this quote, heroism is not a way of being, but it is a specific set of skills that are used in certain situations. Scott Allison is one of our former board members. He writes really prolifically on heroism, and I will suggest that you guys look into his writing too. But this quote really speaks to, we at HIP, we like to separate heroism, the act, from hero the person. Okay, so we separate the action from the person because we want our students to focus on the behavior of the hero and not so much on the individual. It is important to have heroes and to be able to look up to them to say, my mom is my hero or Gandhi is my hero, but we also want people, we don't want people to ascribe godlike status to their heroes. We don't want people to put their heroes on a pedestal. When people do that, they separate themselves from the hero, and it kind of makes them think, oh, like the hero's on a pedestal over there, and they're different than me. They're a higher being than me, and I could never do what they do. And we don't want that. We want people to see themselves as being capable of emulating the hero. The other thing is we want people to be able to criticize heroes, right? There are heroes that over time, when new information comes to light, you might feel conflicted about their character. Heroes are flawed because they are people, which is actually kind of comforting because it means that heroes are more like us and that we can act more like them. So our definition of an everyday hero is a little bit different. Whereas our definition of the hero is pretty specific, this definition is really broad. And we like to use the phrase small h heroism to describe everyday heroes. But it's really just somebody that does the right thing in a given situation. This can be little acts of kindness, smiling at somebody on the street, helping somebody carry their groceries. It doesn't necessarily entail risk or sacrifice. These actions are by nature frequent and proactive. They're really easy to do in our everyday context. And these actions, we believe, really prevent the need for more reactive and risky acts of heroism that might be needed later if situations are allowed to continue, if situations are allowed to escalate. We think acts of everyday heroism can really nip things in the bud before they get out of control, before that big H heroism, that death-defying stunt is necessary. We also use this phrase for like moral and ethical reasons because it can be very complicated and unwise to go into an elementary school classroom and encourage kids to take risks and make sacrifices for their fellow humans. Parents don't love that, right? And we need to wait till kids are a little bit older to talk about things explicitly like that. So we use everyday heroism instead. If you're wondering, well, what do these people mean specifically a hero? Let's break that down a little bit. This is really what we're talking about. We're talking about this set of traits on the left side of the screen, and we're talking about the skills on the right side of the screen as well. And where the hero's journey is concerned, the hero's journey has a whole element of, if you look at number 5 here, one of the key skills of a hero is they have to be able to problem solve and overcome obstacles. The hero's journey is an obstacle course of problem solving and barriers that you have to overcome. Okay, so we think that, again, making the hero's journey explicit is an explicit set of instructions for how to problem solve, how to overcome obstacles. Number 6, a commitment to personal development. This is also big hero's journey real estate here too, because the hero's journey is that model of how you grow up, how you mature, how you develop personally. Okay, so in our mission, we talk about we want people to take effective action in challenging situations. And there are really 2 types of challenging situations I want to illuminate for you here. Some of those situations are about external processes, okay? And before I give these examples, when I say effective action, we mean action that you take to improve a situation while also reducing harm and risk to those involved. We like wise and strategic heroes. We don't like dumb adrenaline junkie heroes. If you're gonna jump into the raging river to save somebody, you need to be jumping in with a flotation device, okay? So as you're taking your heroic action, we want to make sure that you've also reduced the risk and you're doing it as wisely as possible. But so these 2, if you'll just read these examples on the screen here, These are the types of challenging situations we want to prepare people to act in. Okay, so in both of those situations, these are about heroism for other people in our external world, right? This is an external process. So a lot of you'll be thinking, okay, what's going on here? This is a novel situation. I don't usually come across this. And your brain, you guys probably know, when your brain comes across novelty, it can struggle to decide what to do. Okay, so a lot of our lessons go into the social and the psychological influence forces that are operating on you when these things are happening, and how those forces can actually they can actually make you act in ways that you never thought were possible, and they can make you not take action, or they can make you actually do things that are unhelpful in these situations. And these situations, they might not feel challenging to us, like sitting behind our keyboards this morning, but again, there is an element of novelty. There's also an element of ambiguity in both of these situations. Even the guy and the boy struggling in the parking lot, it could just be a kid being a brat with his dad, right? Or the kid could be getting kidnapped. And in the moment, our brains trying to deal with that novelty struggle to figure out what's going on. So this is the challenge that we really tackle in a lot of our lessons. But there's also effective action in challenging situations when it is primarily an internal process, okay? And those situations might look more like this, if you'll read these two scenarios on the screen again. So in both of these situations, these are also situations where we want to help people take effective action, okay? And this is about the internal process. So again, external process, this is more, or excuse me. So the external process is more about that big H heroism, that heroism for others. And this internal process is more about the hero's journeys, the transformative processes that happen within us when we are facing challenging and ambiguous situations. So I want to just go over why we use heroes. This is such a fun theme, right? But that's not the only reason why we're using them. We're using them very deliberately. Heroes do two really important things for us. They give us wisdom. They teach us how to be better people, how to acquire new skills, how to deal with things. And they also largely inspire us. They give us energy. They elevate our spirits. They make us want to make the world a better place. Heroes can also supply us with the stories that we need to discuss life lessons that can be difficult to grasp. Okay, so there are all these non-rational phenomena in life, like suffering, like our folks in Flint who were suffering needlessly, like sacrifice, and like love. It can be hard to discuss those phenomena without the context of stories. And that's why we use heroes, because they provide those rich story landscapes for us. They just give us the context that we need to talk about hard to apply life lessons sometimes. We also use heroes because heroes are naturally unifying. This is also the easiest way to tell a villain from a hero is you ask, okay, does this person seek to unify and include, or are they dividing and excluding? Okay, because you always get a devil's advocate that sees that list of traits of a hero and they say, oh, well, Hitler had some of these traits, right? Hitler was a good leader. Hitler was courageous. And yeah, but Hitler wasn't a hero because Hitler divided and he excluded. Okay, so this is the easiest way to tell a villain from a hero. But we also just love that principle of unification in general. Everybody can kind of get together around hero stories. Everybody is in awe of heroes. And so it can really connect people in the audience and help people talk about various subjects. And we also use heroes because they give us these two interesting dimensions to discuss with people. Again, this is about the internal process of heroism, this heroic action, this more traditional idea of heroism, the action for other people, this death-defying risk-taking act. But there's also the second dimension, which is about the hero's transformation. Again, what is going on the inside? What are the psychological processes associated with heroism? So The first one is really about how are we good citizens? How are we proactive? How are we doing good things for the world? And the second one is really about how are we doing things for ourselves, right? How are we actually becoming the best selves that we can be? And how are we fulfilling our personal potential? So we're kind of circling closer to this idea that I mentioned earlier that now our definition of heroism does include this idea of kind of becoming our best selves. Heroes give us a model for how we should live. We revere them. We kind of consider them like the pinnacle of human behavior sometimes to be a hero. So heroes can show us like, this is the kind of person that I want to be. This is how I want to devote my life, which can be really exciting, right? If you have this model of values and actions and traits, and I have this person, or maybe a couple heroes that I really want to emulate, that can be so exciting. But as these other authors, Marcus and Nereus, tell us, they remind us that we are also very scared of becoming these selves, which is just so ironic. We might have this clear vision of who we want to become, but we are also at the same time terrified of becoming this best version of ourselves. And again, it's hard to deal with that irony. It's hard to unpack that and understand why that's the case. But when we view hero stories and when we see our heroes going through that paradoxical experience of knowing who I want to be, but being terrified to go get it, that is where we can really start to understand what that is like when we use the hero's journey and when we use hero stories. Okay. So let's pivot for a moment here, and I want to talk about why we can't do the right thing. This is why HIP exists. HIP exists because at one point in time we were interested in, okay, it's clear that sometimes people can't do the right thing at the right time. We've all spent at least 5 minutes on the internet, haven't we? So we all know that people can be mean and not responsible and just cruel sometimes, right? And why is that? Why is that happening? And it could be happening for a variety of different reasons. There are a few on the screen, but there's probably 700 I could have listed up here. And a large majority of the barriers between us and doing the right thing are these social psychological influence forces. So some of you will be familiar with phrases like bystander behavior, dealing with the spotlight effect. We have all these problematic cognitive biases like the confirmation bias, in-group, out-group bias. We feel diffusion of responsibility. We get distracted and we're not mindful. We don't notice that things are going on that need our help. Sometimes we have a low sense of self-efficacy. We say, I can't do anything about that, so I'm not going to do anything, right? Sometimes we just can't do the right thing. And our founder, Dr. Zimbardo, in his childhood, he was asking a really similar question. He grew up he grew up fairly poor in the Bronx in the 30s and 40s, and he saw a lot of his friends, oh man, like some of my friends are falling in line with the smugglers and the drug traffickers. And some of my friends are going to school and they're becoming altar boys and they're, being good citizens. So what is the difference between these two groups? Why do some people choose bad choices and why do some people make the right choice? And the world at this time was asking a similar question, right? You folks might recognize this is a scene from the Nuremberg trials. Post-World War II, the entire world was asking and reeling from all of the evidence that we saw of all the atrocities that had been committed, the Holocaust and other genocidal actions that took place during World War II. How could ordinary people do such terrible things to their neighbors? How is this possible? So in the mid 20th century, science was really exploring this question. How is it possible that ordinary, nice people can change and do terrible things? And there were several experiments that illustrated more so about why this was happening. And some of you folks might be familiar with some of these experiments, but in this first one, there is an experiment confederate. So the person who doesn't know they're in an experiment, right? And so the confederate was able to identify line lengths correctly when they were by themselves, But when there are other people around, they were not able to identify them correctly. They would give the answer that the rest of the group had given, just so that they weren't different and that they fit in, that they didn't rock the boat. So that's pretty low stakes to say, oh, I think line B is the answer, when you know clearly it's line A, but you that badly want to fit in, you don't want to look weird, that you even give the wrong answer on a silly question like this. Okay. So suddenly we start to see like, oh boy, maybe I can see how it was possible for people in the Holocaust to do crazy things like this, if something with such low stakes as this impacted people's behavior. You all might be familiar with the Stanley Milgram experiment. Milgram and Zimbardo actually grew up together in the Bronx, which I find fascinating. But his experiment showed that if there was an authority figure present, and if they were wearing a white coat, and if they said, I am in charge of the experiment here, the underling would do really terrible things if the authority figure authorized them to do it. And so the authority figure really creates a permission structure where the underlings say, oh, it's cool, I'm just going to do whatever the authority figure tells me to do because they are responsible for the consequences. Bad, 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 bad. Okay, this experiment, this was more of a stunt than an experiment, but a teacher, Jane Elliott, she separated her class into those with brown eyes and blue eyes. She did this the day after Martin Luther King was shot. And this separation of her class, she informed the blue-eyed kids that they were better, prettier, and smarter than the brown-eyed kids. And you can only imagine the behavior that ensued. The blue-eyed kids were making fun of the brown-eyed kids, being really cruel to them, and then the brown-eyed kids were taking it, and the brown-eyed kids were expressing like learned helplessness and feeling really bad about themselves. So all of these experiments really showed that when you put people in certain situations with certain roles, and certain truths, certain costumes, they will act differently than they might act when they are by themselves and when those social influence forces are not at play. I also want to note that the Milgram and the brown eye, blue eyes experiments, both of those, it would be unethical to try to replicate those experiments in the modern day, especially the brown eye, blue eyes experiment. I know that Jane Elliott took a lot of criticism for that. I might criticize her too for that, but I just wanted to note that a couple of these experiments are not necessarily ethical in nature, and that's why we have institutional review boards today to make sure that none of that happens anymore. So Zimbardo decided, he looked at these 3 experiments and said, okay, so we've seen how context affects behavior, but I want to create a total simulation. Okay, so I want it to be like as real of a scenario as we can get. So he said, all right, I'm going to make a fake prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology department. I'm going to invite, I'm going to get 15 guys together, normal, I say quote unquote, normal, psychologically normal Stanford male students. We're going to dress half of them up as cops. We're going to dress half of them up as prisoners. We're going to put them in this basement, and we're going to tell the guards to maintain order in the prison. And that's all we're going to tell them. And we're going to see what happens. Okay, so we're creating an entire situation. We have the costumes, we have the stage, we have the roles, we have the role players. We're going to put these people in the situation and see what happens, right? Yep, it was very problematic to say the least. Some of you are probably familiar with this story, but within minutes and continuing for days, we saw extreme physical and psychological abuse take place, really disturbing behavior from both the guards and the prisoners, and this behavior was threatening the safety of everybody involved. One prisoner actually had to be released within 36 hours because he started to have a mental breakdown. Guards forced prisoners to engage in really belittling and demeaning behaviors. They devised really cruel punishments for the prisoners too. And again, they didn't get any instruction from the experimenting staff. They were just told to keep order in the prison, right? So we saw just exceedingly problematic behavior because and all of these kids, these are all Stanford students, right? But when they were in this prison, when they were in this situation, they completely adopted the roles of the situation, and it really negatively impacted their behavior in it. And again, this experiment also extremely unethical. Zimbardo has gotten a lot of criticism about this experiment, as he should. And we actually see on the next slide here, we talk about the hero in the Stanford basement. This experiment was so unethical that we actually had somebody interrupt it and say, hey, you got to stop this right now. So this woman on the screen, this is Christina Maslach. Christina was a young psychology professional, and she and Zimbardo were romantically involved during this summer when the SP was happening. And he invited her to come see what's going on. He said, hey, you're a psychology professional. Like, you would probably be interested intellectually in what's happening in this basement here. And when Maslach saw what was going on, she was entirely emotionally disturbed. And she said, Phil, do you see what you're doing to these boys? Do you see what this experiment, the situation that you've created is allowing them to do? You have created this environment, this factory for evil. This is on you, Phil. This is your responsibility. You've created this situation where everybody is acting a fool. And she said, if you don't stop this right now, I am breaking it off, because I do not want to be dating a person who is creating this type of situation. So Zimbardo was just flabbergasted by this response. And he realized that the situation, the social psychological forces in the situation were so powerful that they had even blinded him to his own role in the experiment. He was making the excuse, oh, it's in the name of science. Oh, we're at Stanford. It's fine. There's this institution around us, this authority figure that will take responsibility. It's all good. And it's all in the name of science. But that blinded him from what he had actually done, which was create a situation where all of this harm was taking place. So we learned some really exciting stuff from all four of those experiments. And the Stanford Prison Experiment further confirmed that the situation, it has a really significant influence over ordinary people. But it also demonstrated the opposite, right? So we also know from Maslach's actions that it's totally possible for somebody to speak up, do the right thing. So now we see that line between good and evil as permeable, right? Which can feel kind of nerve-wracking, because you're like, well, okay, I know that I think I'm a good person, right? I hope I'm a good person, but I know that I can fall prey to evil's influence just as easily as I can fall prey to the influence to do something good, okay? So this is where this idea of the banality of heroism, that heroism is something that everyday ordinary people can do. This is where that idea really came, really started to get emphasized. And there is an article called The Banality of Heroism that I would encourage everybody to read. And this is where Zimbardo thought to himself, he said, I bet you that this stuff can be taught. Whatever it was about Christina Maslach that made her stand up and speak out in that basement, I think that we can teach this stuff. And so Zimbardo really, he went through a transformation of how he viewed his work. Again, this question up until he was about 50 years old, or I guess he was about 40 at the time, but he was asking the question, what makes people do bad things? And he said, hold up, I need to ask the opposite. I need to ask what makes people act heroically. And so in asking that question, we suddenly have the development of HIP. Okay, and for those of you out there who are, you're familiar with the concept of magical thinking, that's what I think about in this instance, is we stopped focusing on the bad guys and why they do what they do. We started focusing on the good guys and why they do what they do. All right, so I'm going to transition back to the hero's journey for the last 20 minutes here. And I tell the HIP origin story because it really demonstrates these two dimensions of heroism. We have the heroic action, and we also have the heroic transformation. Okay, Maslach acted heroically, and Zimbardo had a heroic transformation. He started to see things differently. He grew and developed as a researcher, as a psychologist. And so again, the hero's journey is really, it is a metaphor for the human experience. Okay. When we encounter a change, these are the general events that we follow to navigate that change. And again, we want to get from, the change tosses us out of equilibrium and we want to come back to equilibrium. This is really a map and kind of even a set of signposts, I sometimes say, and the signposts tell you. I don't bring this to you as, wow, you guys, look at this. Isn't this so cool, right? Because this is actually a pretty standard procedure, okay? This is something that happens to us every single day. And it's something that happens to people across cultures, across time, across regions in every quarter of the world, which is kind of comforting because it means that we're kind of all in this together. All right, so we'll talk about this guy really quickly. A lot of you might be familiar with Joseph Campbell. He wrote fairly prolifically in the 40s and 50s about the hero's journey. He was the first person to kind of really identify, okay, this is what the journey is, and then popularize it where like the English and literature storytelling community was concerned. He saw the hero's journey as, first of all, this is the journey that heroes go through when they act heroically, when it's that external process. But there is also this internal process of the hero or the main character seeking bliss. Bliss is kind of synonymous with like that seeking of the best self. But bliss is specifically, it's happiness and contentment with life, vocation, and purpose. So there is a note about there's a lot to dig into there about mastery and self-efficacy. We get deep into growth mindset. We work with sports teams often, and we use the hero's journey again because on that trail of tests and all those trials that the hero goes through, there's a lot of mastery activity to be done, a lot of deliberate practice. So you can see how some of these stages can spin off into a lot of different topics that we can teach people about concerning life. So heroism researchers have recently started to adopt this idea that Campbell had, that heroes, the process that they go through, the internal process they go to, it is about following bliss. It is about becoming our best self. It is about reaching our human potential. And I love this idea of heroes as models for a positive, possible self. But what's super ironic, and you all will be familiar with this, we all know this, we are sometimes really, really afraid of our potential awesomeness, aren't we? We fear to let our light shine really brightly. We fear to try really, really hard to achieve something, which is just unbelievably ironic to me. And again, hero stories can help us deal with that irony. It's hard to explain out of context, like why we would be afraid of becoming our best selves. But when we have different stories to contextualize that conversation, we suddenly start to understand, okay, I see how these experiences relate to mine, and I understand how we might be afraid to seek the best version of ourselves. We do go through different journeys at different ages. So depending on what decade you are in, you might be seeking identity. And you can still develop identity like when you're in your 60s and 70s. This still happens, absolutely. But typically younger people are seeking identity. They're developing their ego, and then older people are seeking generativity. So they are more about ego deconstruction. Older folks might be seeking meaning outside of themselves. Again, it's that change from the egocentric me to the sociocentric we. So different journeys at different stages. The journey looks a little bit different depending on what source you're using. And I always tell people, I say, like, as long as the events are generally in the same order, sometimes your journey is not going to have all the events on it. Like I don't always have a like threshold guardian when I cross my first threshold. Okay. I don't always have, I don't always meet an ally on my journey either. Sometimes I just meet a mentor and no allies. Chris Vogler, if you are a writer, if you are really into literature, you might look at the hero's journey through Chris Vogler's work. He writes about how to use the journey specifically for playwriting, for writing movies, for writing stories. His book is super readable, lots of graphics. I like how he splits the journey into 4 acts, and then he also reduces the number of steps. Joseph Campbell's original model had 17, and Chris Vogler uses 12 here. For those of you that are interested in looking at the journey through a personal development lens, Clive Williams is an Australian clinical psychologist. He lives on the Gold Coast in Brisbane, and he uses the hero's journey in his clinical practice, and he makes explicit the journey stages to people so that they can actively navigate their own psychological experience. Clive thinks that the hero's journey is really the process of integrating all of your experiences into a more complete whole. So really like making sense of your experiences. He reminds us that hero's journeys present as 4 different things, okay? But most of the time when they present, they're not usually totally welcome, right? They're kind of, again, an interruption of our old world. And Clive also specifically points out that there are 3 types of heroes. There are heroes that are very intentional. So let's say you just got a diagnosis and suddenly you're like, I got to cut out all red meat. I got to stop drinking beer. I got to stop eating bread or whatever it is, right? You might be high on motivation to change. You might have a serendipitous journey where a change just happens to you that doesn't feel very good at first, but then at the end of it, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize I needed that, but I definitely needed to make that change. And then there's the reluctant journey, and we're all familiar with what this feels like when the hero kicks and screams to avoid the change. Okay, I'm very familiar with that. So Clive comforts us too. He reminds us, he says, look for your allies. Okay, look for your allies. They are your first reward in the journey. Okay, so remember the allies stage, that's going to happen over here very close to the beginning at about 3:34 o'clock. That's rolled up in the meeting the mentor phase. Okay, so meeting your allies is going to be the first indication that you are moving along on this journey, the first indication of hope. So I just wanted to ask the group, and you all can enter this in the chat if you wish, or you can just reflect on it in whatever space you're in. But I want to know, are you navigating a journey right now? Okay. This can be any magnitude of journey. Perhaps you are adjusting to being an empty nester. Perhaps you are dealing with the opportunity to, you've gotten the opportunity to get a promotion to become an executive, but you're not sure if you want to do that because you're actually trying to move closer to retirement, right? So that's an opportunity, but also a challenge. Okay, maybe you are dealing with a medical diagnosis. Somebody earlier mentioned that they are interested in aging, right? So maybe that's part of your journey right now is trying to learn how to inhabit a body that has different capabilities now that it's getting a little bit older. But I ask you, do you think you're an intentional hero? Are you a serendipitous hero? Are you reluctant? And could you maybe use the journey, if you use it as a map, and if you use these stages as the signposts, could you possibly navigate with a little bit more savvy if you did it actively using these stages? Okay, and just to close out here, I want to show you all, some of you might recognize this journey in different formats. So let me show you some different formats. We see this pattern when we talk about behavioral change models. So those of you in social work, those of you also in like HR, leadership development, you might be familiar with this phrasing. This is the hero's journey. This is the process of change. This applies really well to the stages of grief. And this model gives us a line instead of a cycle. But you guys can see how, denial, this is where we get the call to action. Like you are called to deal with this grief, and you might deny that it's happening. I'm going to refuse the call. I'm not going to deal with it. And then eventually you go into this pit where you are tested emotionally, just like the hero is tested on the journey. They deal with all those trials and tests and tribulations that end up making them stronger. and then you eventually come up. There's a rising action on the other side. You come back to equilibrium, right? We also see a similar shape when it comes to resilience process models. You guys might know that in order to display resilience, it actually requires you to encounter adversity. Same with the hero's journey. You have to have a challenge in order to go on the journey. I like this model too because it highlights integration and growth as two key processes of resilience, same way with the hero's journey. When we teach kids, I mentioned earlier, we work with sports teams sometimes, and we also work with learners on learning how to learn. And when we do that, our hero's journey looks a lot more like this. And this is really the experience of a learner learning a new skill. You know, there's obviously this pit where they fall off the skateboard and they break their, you know, they break the skin, they break a wrist, whatever, but eventually if you get back on that skateboard, you can learn how to do it and then eventually teach other people how to do it at the mentorship stage. And then one last familiar model. If you are familiar with this, great. I hope that this model has helped you a lot. This is the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps. These 12 steps also apply to Narcotics Anonymous. But I love this. First of all, the first step is to admit that we're powerless over alcohol. So this is like you're accepting the call. Okay, I've admitted that I have a problem. I need to change. I'm out of the pre-contemplation phase. I'm looking at my problem dead in the face right now. Okay. And then the last phase is about mentorship. Some of you will know that the last phase of AA is for you to become a sponsor for another alcoholic that is earlier on in their journey, right? Again, this is the hero's journey. Okay, so your call to action, and then we can move into some Q&A if anybody has any comments or questions. But what do we do now? Okay, we just heard about the hero's journey. We're excited. This is very cool. What do we do? I have some suggestions for you. And the first one is to know explicitly who are my heroes, identify them as individuals by name, and understand why you have those heroes. Okay, again, separating the person from the action. I want you to elaborate why specifically is this person my hero? Identify a current journey that you are on. Okay, again, is it a change, a challenge, an opportunity, a crisis? Are you a reluctant hero? Is this a serendipitous journey and you're kind of along for the ride? Or are you a highly motivated, active hero? Can you use the journey to more actively navigate your current experience? Okay, next slide, there are some fun resources. So you can choose one of those to dig into. Again, there are books, articles, however you like to consume your learning content. You all can also sign up for our level 1 course. This course is done asynchronously. So you can do it at your own pace. It's really just a series of videos and reflection questions. And we recommend that people take that. We get people having a lot of fun taking it with a small community group. We had a library board take it together recently and they had fun with that. We've also had a lot of homeschool groups. So moms and dads with their kids will take our level 1 course as kind of like an intro to citizenship. And then I also have our email here if anybody wants to get in touch, admin@heroicimagination.org. And then I'll just flash these cute little resources on the screen, but I will ask one of your, either Todd or one of the leaders of Humanists of Greater Portland, I will ask them to distribute these resources to you all via email so that you can dig into them on your own time. But we can move on to any Q&A that you folks might have. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Ellie, for such a powerful presentation. I love this presentation today. It had optimism, research, and calls to action. It really had everything we're looking for at HGP. I'll start out with the first question as we get this organized. So there's a couple of ways. I'm going to ask this question on behalf of our students in the audience. A couple of ways it seems like they can really participate and go deeper in the presentation today. One is via online, as you mentioned, and I'm sure some students are out there and they're saying, gosh, I wish this was in my high school or my college. Is there a way that you encourage kids to advocate within their school to have this taught?
Yeah, that is an awesome question. And hello to all the young people out there. I think some of you are about to embark on a hero's journey of leaving high school and embarking on the rest of your exciting life. So that is awesome. A couple ways to engage with this content and bring it to your school. We have a program called the Hip Hero Club. So if you're at a high school right now, you're probably familiar. You have like clubs that people can be a part of, and you meet at lunch or you meet after school. They're everything from like the Young Scientist Club to like, Students Demand Action Against Gun Violence Club. And you can it's a very well packaged curriculum. There's a cost of $25 to student groups, but we can issue scholarships to people if they need those. But it's a 12-week curriculum. It has presenters guides, it has PowerPoints, it has worksheets, it has everything that you need to, as a student, run a club on your own. And you can also talk to your school leadership. I encourage kids to ask their school leadership, hey, what is our comprehensive plan to help our students learn how to stand up and do the right thing? And that is a powerful question. What is your plan to help us learn how to be effective citizens and how to do the right thing? And, I asked my principal that question when I worked at a school, in the last few years, and she said, gee, that's a really good question. I know that we have some anti-bullying content, but otherwise, I'm not sure if we have everything that that our students need to do that. So I made her think hard about the other resources she needed to ask students. So definitely challenge, or just ask your school leadership if they have a plan, and then you can present that solution of the Hip Hero Club to them if that feels appropriate.
Thank you, Ellie. We're going to go to our Zoom audience for Chaz, who modeled the questioning process so well. Chaz, go ahead with your question.
So there's a big intersection, I'm sure you'll agree, between the anti-hero and the hero, depending on the people perspective. The biggest one that comes to my mind is Joshua versus the people of Canaan. I'm wondering how much, I'm sure that's part of your studies, and I'm just wondering how much of your focus is on that dichotomy.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Normally I'm pretty well versed in my Bible stories, but I am forgetting the story of Joshua. But I think what really he is, I remember him as like a flawed hero, right?
I don't think in the Bible he's pictured that way. He's the one who led the Israelites into Canaan to take them.
Okay, I think I was thinking of Job. I was thinking of Job.
Oh yeah, oh, yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, so yes, anti-heroes do come up. And I think the way that we typically discuss that is, again, we want to separate the person from their behavior. And sometimes you have an anti-hero who, like, if anybody has seen Deadpool, the Deadpool movies, those really describe Deadpool as doing good things, but also doing really terrible things at the same time. So when we talk about anti-heroes, we really want to dive into their specific behavior and break the behaviors down, because there are examples of heroes. We have this example of an anti-hero who saved a bunch of people during Katrina. He was a former felon who stole a school bus in order to get all these people out of an area where, they were going to be at risk for flooding and drowning. And so we talk about this guy. We need to separate his behaviors out. Like, yes, was he involved in drug trafficking and crimes? Absolutely. But also he has these redeeming qualities about him. So we do anti-heroes. I wouldn't say that they're a huge focus of our work, but they do come up. And, like I said earlier, there are the devil's advocates that say like, well, like I want to talk, Donald Trump is my hero. And, then you have to kind of field those more difficult conversations to break down the behavior and talk about, okay, this behavior is heroic, but also this behavior is not, and really look at our heroes with a critical eye.
Ellie, you become more and more of a hero to this group by mixing up your Bible characters there. You raised your street cred tremendously.
So I'm not talking so much
try.
about the dichotomy of the individual, but the act itself. So Joshua basically did ethnic cleansing,
Oh,
which
yeah.
looked at in the Bible as he's a hero. Wonder he gave this land to us, but the people of Canaan, I'm sure, did not look at that like that act was anything but a horror.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that helps us resolve that tension is to talk about are you unifying or are you dividing? So if it's about deciding if I think what we're talking about is Joshua's kind of a subjective hero. Like he is a hero to some people and then clearly not a hero to some other folks, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
anti-hero. Yeah.
Yep. And I think, I
But
mean, and then that's a very complicated subject. And then you're talking about philosophically, what is the greater good? Who gets to decide what the greater good is? Are ethics, morals, and values like universally good across all cultures? Or can we justify like a subjective set of values that might not work for certain groups of people? So that conversation does get kind of messy, but we also pull out that heroic unification principle, which sounds a lot more scientific than it is. It really just asks, is the hero unifying or are they dividing? Are they including and bringing more constituents in, or are they excluding people? And I think that like I think today Joshua, we could probably criticize his actions quite a bit. I don't know. And I think that Joshua, he has to do with does he have to do with like the land that Israel now calls home, right?
yes, and
Right.
God said,
Yeah.
honor my father and mother, so that you will enjoy the land that I give you.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, we have quite a few
Yeah.
questions, so we're gonna move
Okay.
on. Jules and Renee, I see your hand in the Zoom audience. We'll get to you momentarily, but first, let's go live to the Friendly House for question number 1.
Okay, well, right now Chaz is my anti-hero because he took my question.
That is the hardest question I've ever received. So good job for you guys for drilling right down to the heart of the content.
Okay, but as a backup, do you have a similar 12-stage outline for people who become villains? You know, people who just like Adolf Hitler. I mean,
So there is, I would say, so there is a villain's journey that if you Google it, you can find it. We don't use it in HIP because again, we don't want to focus a lot on the bad guys. We don't want to focus on, that's why we don't do like anti-bullying programs, because it's the same thing with Zimbardo being very focused on why people do bad things. And it's kind of that principle of magical thinking that what you bring about or what you think about, you bring about. So we don't want to focus very much on the villain's story. We want to focus on the hero's story and really just encourage that behavior. So I'm not super familiar, but Mike, I think that you could probably lay the villain's journey closely onto the hero's journey. But when we come to this stage of reward and transformation, I think the villain might value a reward that like you or I wouldn't value necessarily, right? Like a dark power to destroy all mankind or something like that. So yeah, definitely a different journey, but we don't focus so much on villains in our education.
More of an approach of understanding your opponent, or who you're fighting against. I think that is kind of an important part of the hero's journey there. Getting to know what your enemy's like and their motivation and such.
I love that you brought that up because it just made me think there is an activity that we do where we identify what your enemies are while you are on the journey. So it's not about the journey of the enemies, but it's about the enemies or the bad guys that you will encounter on the journey. And especially when we're talking about psychological processes, people we do a drawing activity where it's like, okay, take what you're scared of. We want you to actually personify that and draw it out. We want you to give it like a little profile, describe it almost like a Pokemon card, because when you give that fear or that anxiety, whatever it is, a name, a backstory, a face, a form, it is easier, as you say, you understand your enemy a little bit better and it's easier to deal with them. So in that respect, I guess that's how we deal with villains.
Now, Jules in our Zoom audience has been a hero in recent weeks for his ability to ask direct, succinct questions. So, Jules, prove your heroic status this morning.
Great talk. My question is more of a comment as usual. Eli Wiesel, who was a childhood survivor of the Holocaust, said that, and you know, I'm not quoting verbatim, but essentially he said, bad people will do bad things. It's good people who see bad things and choose to ignore it. And that's where the chasm exists between a heroic act and playing it safe, not rocking the boat. That's one comment. The other comment is, during the Nuremberg trials, a common response defense was just obeying orders. So alkalites will do this all the time, and they're doing it right now on the political spectrum. I mean, we had a chance to solve the immigration problem, but it wasn't going to happen. So we're dealing with what you talk about historically and every single day. So I'm 90 years old, and I want to make the world a little better before I leave. And I'm writing the letters and supporting the candidates and giving my discretionary money. Where do you feel that you've done something concrete enough to know that maybe you made a difference?
Well, it sounds like I feel like that question is between you and your spiritual guides, not necessarily between you and me. Oh boy, well, Jules, I really appreciate those comments. I'm not sure if I can tell you, yes, you have done it, you have done a good job, but HIP really thinks that every little bit counts, okay? Again, every little act of everyday heroism, every letter you write, every time you talk to somebody about your values and why you feel like this candidate really embodies those values, every time you do that, you are doing your part and you are doing the best that you can do in order to impact the situation. So, I mean, I think you're doing a pretty good job, Jules. I am inspired by your testimony of you doing that at 90 years old. You're not throwing in any towel. So I think in that sense, you can consider yourself successful because you've given me a little bit of juice for my tank right here, right now. But I also want to comment on, I think what you say about what Elie Wiesel said was very astute. And he talked about how it's not the problem that the majority of people are doing bad things. The problem is that the majority of people might not do anything at all, right? They might stand by, be bystanders, and they might not act. And that seems kind of hopeless at first, but then you think, wait a second, okay, if the majority of people aren't bad guys, but they're just not doing anything, that means there are like a ton of these bystanders that can be activated to actually act. So we like to really focus we like to focus on this huge majority of people that aren't really doing anything, not necessarily the people that are doing bad things. And then I do your comment about like just obeying orders, right? It's funny because we sometimes run into interesting conversations with school leadership, because when we come into a ninth grade classroom and we talk about this obedience to authority, we want to talk about it in a way that equips the kids to stand up and speak out against authority, but then we get a little bit of, hey, wait a minute, from school leaders who say, well, we don't want them to push back against us. We want them to push back against other people. So that's kind of an ongoing tricky discussion that we continue to navigate.
Thank you so much for your personal comments and your very astute dealing with a problem that has long been neglected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jules.
Jules. Let's go to question number 2 at the Friendly House.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it. The idea of status quo, staying in the status quo. I look at Florida and their unwillingness to look at history in their education system. If it makes anyone uncomfortable, then you can't teach it. Slavery, things like that. How do you deal with people that don't want to leave and go on the want to stay in the status quo?
That is such a good question. How do we deal with people who do not want to go on the journey, who do not want to change, who want to dig in, who want to even reverse things, right? That's a really hard one. And some wisdom that I might offer, this is not going to be a very satisfying answer because I do not have an answer. I don't necessarily have a solution. It is important for us to meet people where they are at and to remember that we can't, no matter how close we are to them, no matter how much we love them, no matter how much data we have to show them that they're, not right, we can't force people to come to a new perspective, right? And when the hero answers the call to adventure and when they decide to change, they are going to do it under their own volition. We can exert pressure, but I mean, we know this, that like all of you in the audience who have had kids, all of you who have a spouse, you know that you can't really force somebody to do something. You can give them the support. What we can do, everybody has heard this time and time again, but when people have different political beliefs than us, we can continue to stick with them. We can refuse to abandon them. We can refuse to ostracize them, right? Heroes unite, they do not divide. So I really think that the only solution for us is to be compassionate and empathetic with those people, to be firm in our values, to articulate, here is how I am adhering to my values in my political beliefs and happenings. Here's how I feel like you're not actually aligned with your core values because of these political beliefs you're touting. But it can be an exercise in patience sometimes. And I know like when there are people who suffer because of political realities, it's very, very difficult to be patient. But I guess I say all that just to warn people that people do have to choose to go on this journey by themselves. We can influence them, but we have to do that with like love and understanding.
Let's stay at our live audience and go to question number 3.
Okay. Complicated question, but I'll make it fast. If the trip around the big circle is a long trip that'll put a lot of pressure on people at the point where they have to do this creative problem solving, and people don't make good decisions when there's pressure on them. A lot of people will make bad decisions in that situation. I think that that how many times do you have to go around this circle? I think habit would be much better than creative problem solving. And that if you went around the circle at least 5 or 10 times a year, you'd probably develop a good habit. How many times in my life should I go around the circle?
Well, if you're not dizzy yet, you're doing it wrong, my friend. You should be very dizzy at this point. That is such a great question. And I think what you're alluding to is you're like, well, how many times do I have to go through this in order to get somewhere, right? Or do we just keep going around and around in a circle? And I appreciate that perspective because I can see how it would be frustrating or feel endless for somebody to be like, oh my God, we're just going around and around and around, aren't we? But every time you go around, and I think the video alluded to it, it said the hero returns to the old world and the status quo, but the status quo is upgraded and the hero is different. And the hero has been transformed by that one trip around the sun. When you finish a journey and you reach the stage, like the mentor stage or the agent of change stage, it means that you now have a new skill, new ability, new knowledge, new wisdom, and you are now you're the Gandalf or the Dumbledore mentor figure who can now take that value and help pass it on to other people. So, and maybe another thing you're alluding to, my friend, is perhaps there is a lack of closure or completion on some journeys. And it might actually feel, and you don't have to do this with every change that you navigate or every new thing that you learn, but you might be able to kind of feel a sense of completion if you articulate what I learned from this journey, what is the value I derived from it, and then actively seek a way to pass on that knowledge to somebody else. That might give you a sense of completion. But we go on these every single day and they don't stop. So again, you might get a little dizzy, but every time you go on one, you develop as a person. You grow into more of that potential best self. And you're also, when you go on these journeys, you're also aligning with personal values, which I think is just a good practice for everyday life.
Let's go to question number 4 at the friendly house.
My question comment actually ties into the last one. So I was thinking about when you talked about the hero's journey, that was the action and the transformation. And the action to me is more external and the transformation being internal. So then I was curious about, it seems to me that would be a continuous feedback loop. So they're not really separate worlds. It's like they're happening congruously all the time, which ties into that. It's like, yeah, so maybe I'm halfway, quote unquote, done with my personal journey, and then something in the external world comes in, and there's an overlap. And then when you then complete the circle, if there's such thing, it's like you have those tools and you put them in your toolbox. So the next time around, you have that skill set. So it seems, like to me, this is a life journey. We're never done, right?
Yep.
It's continuous learning. So, so how do you think about that? That what the way I said, feedback loop between those two. Does that sound along the lines of your guys' philosophy?
It absolutely does. And I think what you have done is in your head, you have taken my explanation a step farther. So what I did was I really deconstructed the two processes. You have action over here and you have transformation over here. They are totally interlocking. They are totally integrated. And so think about I guess Edward Snowden might be one. And he's a controversial hero. Was what he did beneficial? Was it, did it hurt the United States? Who knows? But he is a heroic figure for some people. But he had an external journey of actually taking the action to release the information, to document all the information and to release it as responsibly as he could. But then he also had at the same time this internal process of having to confront the consequences of what is going to happen to me if I do this. I have to confront the fear of maybe being hunted by the US federal government for the rest of my life. And I have to, have the humility to know that this issue is way bigger than me and that I have a responsibility to do this. So you have taken my presentation to the 2.0 level. Yes, those processes happen simultaneously, but we like to separate them out just to make it a little bit simpler for our models and for our learners. But yeah, those things can interlock. And what you say about feedback loops does feed into how I answered the last question. Every time you go around the circle, you are learning something. So that new learning, wisdom, ability, what have you, is feeding into, that's in your tool belt now for you to move forward and go on your next journey. So that feedback loop is definitely engaged there.
I think that's a beautiful note to end our Q&A on. Ellie, this was truly a remarkable and beneficial presentation. You really accomplished the objectives of today. You gave us calls to action, spurred great dialogue, and I know that I'm going to act more heroically moving forward. You gave me some things to think about. I know many others feel the same way.